And we are live. Hello and welcome everybody to the Wide World of Warhammer. With me today, we've got New Zealand's finest export himself, David Gaylard. How you doing, buddy?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks for having me on, man. It's nice. Sam's actually been a supporter and active for years, actually. I remember when we first started the podcast, Sam was commenting and stuff like that. So it's really nice to be here. It's nice to see you got your show and stuff like that as well, man.
Oh, appreciate the kind words. Oh, look, I mean, we played in a TTS event a long time ago with Denise and Simon. I remember we came onto the scene.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, so
wow, that was the end. That was the very end of 8th edition, where I was playing Shining Spears. Yeah.
Oh, no.
It was the end of it.
It was 9th edition. You were running Tyranid Warrior. It was like Tyranid Warrior Codex. It was 9th edition.
Oh, right.
I was playing Light Harleys and stuff like that. So not that early, but still pretty early in the whole piece. So
that's funny.
Yeah. Still remember, I was like, oh, yeah, this random fella. It's like, oh, how'd you know David Gaylard did? He was like, oh, yeah, played with him a couple of times and then seen you just status climb all the way through. So it's been great to follow your journey and look, support the people that support you, right? And try and that's always good information that you guys at the 40K Fireside do with Vic and all the rest of the Teaming Night crew. So we're not here to talk explicitly about Teaming Night and Vic. We're here to talk about getting them 20s, Mr. Gaylard, and a fine role that you definitely put yourself in a couple of times in your teams with the Pyro Cup and then obviously WTC and stuff like that. So trying to explore that topic a bit more, a bit of the theory behind it, how it works in the pairings process, and then some in-game stuff. So before you deep dive into that sort of elements, Dave, how important do you find having a sword in your team is? Like, is it critical to have someone who gets these 20s, or is it just a nice to have?
Oh, yeah, man. Yeah, first up, to set the scene, there's obviously a difference between 8-mans and 5-mans if you're playing, so not everything is directly applicable, but in a broad sense, it's kind of applicable if you're doing 5s or 8s or etc. And what I would say is that, like, when I'm talking about this stuff, that's just my philosophy. I know that a lot of teams have different philosophies on this, for example, and I think the higher up you go, and, if you're playing... Actually, no, that's not true, because France also does this, but... Some teams don't have the sword shield all-rounder analogy. They just have they focus more on army composition and matrices, and then try and align armies up good where they do fit. Or they might have just a blunder, for example. That's not how I see teams working in its best capability, and it also depends on the players that you have available to your team as well. So it's a tricky one, and teams is really tricky, and getting the composition right between player specialities in terms of their playstyle, what they're good at, and then the factions that they're on is a really tough puzzle, and that's why I think WTC is so interesting, because it's really, really hard to achieve, actually. So there's no fixed formula to it, but I kind of see the sword shield as a really solid base, a foundational base that you can start with. Sorry, all my context blew out the original question there.
No, it's completely fine. And we'll go on tangents throughout. We'll dive deep into the whole philosophy and stuff like that. So we'll go on different tangents and things like that. And yeah, obviously solving that 8-man team comp for WTC is already hard in itself. Throw into a spanner into the works of you having barely a month before this sub and a whole new edition and stuff like that as well. That makes things even harder. So you mentioned there, Team France has a comp ideology. Do you mind expanding what that ideology maybe looks like? Because that is a sword in itself, like it's maybe pouncing on some things, but not being a dedicated sword.
Exactly, yeah. So, yeah, and that's a good way of saying, obviously Olivier Weiss, who scored 4 points higher than me at WTC. I was the second highest scorer at WTC. And then they had Matt Bonet as well do very well. I think to certain degrees, for their team composition, I would think it's fair to say that they were a sword-type player. And the sword-type player is typically a player that uses resources for the team, right? So let's say, for example, let's use Team New Zealand, for example. So in our team, we had me on Thousand Suns, and we had Jonty on Necrons with Silent King double monolith build as well. So kind of similar to France, because we have a skew build in there as well. And we decided, first and foremost, that I would be basically the first sword, and then Jonty would be second. So what that means directly in that sense is that I would have priority over Jonty, and then Jonty would have priority over everyone else. And where this happens, and obviously in the pairings process is where this is all applied, by when I say sucking up resources, because in the WTC meta, the best way to kind of lay up, so to speak, if you play basketball, lay up and then someone slams, is to be in the third defender slot. And now the reason that happens is because in the third defender slot, you've gone through enough iterations of defending that if you do your defenders first and second, such that they'll attack with matchups that are good into your sword, then you get to a matrix position very quickly that you are third defending with only one draw matchup and the rest of them are fours. So what that means is that it doesn't matter what they attack with, because you're always getting a 4, for example. And the reason that sucks up resources is because other parts of your matrix get worse to make your sword, to empower your sword, right? And that's basically what happened at WTC for New Zealand. Consistently, I had every single pairing I wanted. Well, in terms of, if I wanted to go down second, I'd go down second. If I wanted to go down third, I'd go down third. I had board pick. I'm a big part of the pairings process in Team New Zealand as well. But in addition to that, we chose first defenders and second defenders such that they would attack with units, armies, factions that were good into my faction as well. So we try and pull the resources away from, pull the factions that are good into me, into our other teams. So we take a slight loss there, knowing that I'll be able to absolutely hammer whatever matchup I go into. And my game plan is almost exactly the same, whatever matchup I can play into. So that's kind of the sword philosophy. In terms of, if you're playing a 5-man, it's a little bit more harder. You might do that role in the first defender role. But in the 8 defender role for WTC, you want to do that in the third defender for the WTC that's just passed. Now at Mperor Cup, I was playing guard, of course. I dropped, I think, 7 points over the event, and that role, as the meta shifts, you want a sword in different ways, obviously. But I thought that the best way to play in that was first defend, and play guard on first defend my board. And yeah, it was extremely successful. I think guard is the best first defend. And it's quite rare, I think, that you have a sword that is a first defender, because typically in 8-mans, you'll have people that will obviously, people that design lists that are direct counters to first defender lists. So that's where it's a bit unique at the moment. And I wouldn't say that that role has always been applicable in the first defender slot. So extremely nuanced in the pairings details there. But that's the kind of levels you need to take it to. And then in your list design, obviously list design is a huge part of being a sword. As a list design process, you need to be able to anticipate if you're going to be on first defender slot, third defender slot, what 4 factions you're primarily going to be playing against, tick harder into them, and that's where you can really get a lot more juice out of the proverbial lemon, so to speak.
Oh, that was a lot of information there, Dave, and it was great to hear. So you mentioned just earlier on in the piece getting a 4 in your matrix. So what does that mean for those people who have maybe never heard that terminology before? Of course.
So every team does this differently. There's no set methodology. So every team does pairings differently. Every team does matrix estimations differently and different philosophies. A 4 for me is in the 13 to 15 range, and typically it's more on the 15 side. So what that means is that when you have a matrix, which if you're not familiar with teams, it's basically a cross grid of estimates of how your army will perform into the remaining armies of your opponent's team, for example. So my matrix, for example, might in the third defender slot look like, so let's say I'm playing Thousand Suns. It might look like a 3 into Thousand Suns, the mirror matchup, and then it might be 4-4-4 against Necron's Sisters and Custodes, for example, right? So that's when now that I'm being put into the third slot as a third defender, I know that they will attack with one of those. And then the remaining matrix will be a combination of 4-4-4 or 3-4-4, which means that I only have to take one of those, which means I guarantee get a 4. So that's what a 4 means to me. I, believe it or not, never actually put a 5, which would be a 18, 19, 20 range in WTC, because realistically there is a skill gap there as well. And pushing for 20s is one thing, but realistically a skill gap is a big component in there as well. And that's something to consider when you're playing and picking an army realistically as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's a big call out to say, look, I'm going to get a booyah per se of like a 20-0, like guaranteed. Yeah. I cannot lose this matchup. But it's a big shot to make. And like, yes, sometimes it does work, but at the WTC level in particular, it's generally very hard. They're not here just to I don't know, roll dice and move models. So
No,
there's they've put some time and effort into that piece. You mentioned earlier on in the conversation, so it sounds like with your T-Sons in particular, building that list, you're designed to beat 4 factions in particular. So was that 4 factions, or was it more like army comps, for example? So was it like anti-tank, or was it more anti-elite sort of thing?
Yeah. So actually, with that, targeting factions is good. And the problem with Thousand Sons in that analogy is that they were obviously extremely strong against almost everything, right? So, as a context to this, if you are kind of one of these players that you're looking at doing this role, you need to be on the right faction. You cannot sword anywhere near as effectively if you're on the wrong faction. So, identifying the faction is a crucial part of the meta going into it, right? You need to. So, for example, I was when the game update happened before WTC, I was like, well, I'm gonna try some Tyranids out, right? Because I thought, wow, Tyranids got a great buff. You know, Crush the Stampede got the move through wall strat, etc. And I was like, wow, okay, this could be something here. So I played Tyranids, and I was beating people. I was beating people in our collaboration with other WTC teams, but I didn't really feel like it had that juice. And in the back of my mind, I knew Thousand Sons is the best army, and I had a build that I was looking at. But I knew in the back of my mind, I was like, look, I need to be going into games to absolutely be crushing people. Thousand Sons is the faction that's going to have that power level to enable me to do that. So I made the swap to Thousand Sons 3 weeks before the tournament, and then I started working on it from there. So identifying the faction that is the right role is critical, and if that's not something you're familiar with, you need to obviously be up to speed with that very quickly as well. So that's a tough thing to overcome, and that might not be directly applicable to everyone. So as a sword, you need to figure out where your faction's weaknesses are. So if your faction has a lot of weaknesses or has 3 bad matchups, for example, then you'd probably need to be in the 3rd defender slot because you need to eliminate some of those bad matchups before you go down. If, for example, you were playing guard at Mperor Cup, for example, straight down first, right? Like, it almost didn't matter what I was playing against. Has an excellent combination of board control and shooting, and that was primarily using the board pick as opposed to using the matchup pick. So once again, there's lots of different ways you can strike it, but at WTC level, it's probably more on the 3rd slot. But at Mperor Cup, because of the meta actually, and because of guard at the moment, it was better to be in the 1st defender slot. So that's when I look at stuff. I go, okay, it's better for me to be in this slot. It's better for me to be in that slot. And I tell my team beforehand, okay, this is what I want to play. This is the best slot for me. This is how to use me, right? That's kind of the way it goes. So back to the topic of list building per se, and kind of for matchups, because I remember the question. The best way to push differential is through primary control, and that needs to be a huge component of your list. You're going to win games, of course, by tabling people, but a lot of people vastly underestimate the way of pushing differential through holding your primary and denying their primary. Every time you do that in a turn, across a turn, you hold yours, deny theirs. It's 1 point differential, right? At a minimum. In fact, it could be 2 point differential, right? Because you hold, so it's +5, them is -5. Almost 2 diff points right there, right? So to get a 15, you need to be pushing into your opponent, holding yours, removing theirs, and if you do that for 5 turns, then you're up in that area, right? So I knew that as a part of the list build philosophy, I really wanted. T-Sons had a big weakness for WTC. One of their weaknesses was that if your opponent didn't want to play the game, they would just stand behind walls. And realistically speaking, going into competition at that level, players are going to know how to play against Thousand Sons, so they will just do that, right? Like if you're a known sword and you're basically here to get 15 plus, 18 plus, whatever, you will play against people that will take fixed, for example. They'll take fixed, they'll sit in their deployment zone, and they'll try and get 3 or 4 points, and they'll consider that a win for their team, right? So your whole game plan needs to change in anticipation of playing against people that will intentionally lose the game at a heavy loss just to try and get points against you. And so to do that, Mutolith Beasts were fantastic because they're a durable asset that can sit on objectives, and they can really push your opponent's primary differential, and that's a direct way. If you want a game plan, right? Well, holding your objective, denying your opponent's objectives is a direct game plan for achieving that, right? Like it's a game philosophy that you can go into every single game. Not to mention the fact that you had Magnus, who's basically like, at the time, a super knight that can go table everyone consistently, right? And direct flame and all that stuff, right? So the army had so much juice behind it anyway. On top of that, but there were some lists. There were lots of Thousand Sons lists. I thought mine was the best at pushing differential, and then others were more take all comer, perhaps wanted to play the Mirror, right? And they were better at playing the Mirror maybe than my list, or they were better at playing all comers, for example. It's debatable. I think the 3 Mutalisk Beast was the strongest in the end, but there were more high cabal ones. Like Vic obviously did really well, Thousand Suns there. And so there's different variants of it. So how you design the list is really, there's so much depth to it that it is really important. There's like another great example of this is at Pyrrha Cup. I played one Scout Sentinel, and the reason I did that was because I knew that CSM was really popular. I knew Tyranids was really popular, and I expected to be hit by that. If our opponents wanted to, I was going to be first. They could attack me with Tyranids and CSM. But I had an Infiltrate to block their Infiltrate, and then I had a Scout Sentinel. Then I had Aquilons after that. So in the case scenario where one of their strongest gun lines, like CSM for example, goes against me, and I get the win, and I go first, then I can move block their deployment choke on turn 1, and then they never leave that at all. And so as their CSM player, they're looking at that and going, well, I can maybe play that, and he's also got 3 tank commanders and a shoot-off, so do I really want to play that and maybe get like, maybe 15-5'd, where I could get points otherwise? Or do we just sacrifice someone straight into it, and try and scrape for points already? So it's the list building design is really big. Anticipating what you're going to play against. Anticipating what you're going to play against is more important when you're a first defender rather than a third defender. And as a third defender, it's more important to have the list design, to have a direct game plan, whether it's you're going to try and play very aggressive to try and table your opponent, or you're going to have strong primary play, etc. Yeah.
A lot of great information there, David, and it was great there at the end there talking about tabling your opponent versus primary denial. And obviously it's more interesting now, and I guess this version 1.2 of Pariah, how secret missions have been nerfed just a little bit more, so you can't catch up as easily in the primary scoring. Still a little bit, but not nearly as much. And I was curious to hear a bit more about, obviously, with your T-Suns and Pure Guard, you sort of had a bit more, I would say, fair to say, a bit of a broader band. But how neat would you go with the attacker role? Because many times it's very easy, or I guess earlier in your team's experience, it's like, oh, we want something anti-knight or anti-big. Let's go Elder with Fire Prisms, your War Walkers, like all the Bright Lances, all the anti-tank, big shooting. But sometimes when you pair like such a list, which is so niche, and I think we'll talk about maybe as well, is like Manny, for example, the Blood Angels that had a very direct role to play. Sometimes you get countered, and it's maybe you're feeling too niche of a role. So how do you, I guess, in the wider team, how do you design a list that doesn't fall victim to that, or do you just take the risk of it happening and pray it doesn't happen? I guess.
Yeah, it's actually a really great point. And at WTC, you'll still find that this happens, which is quite surprising. But I think in general we're pretty bad at Warhammer. Like we haven't solved the game like to any degree, not like League of Legends or something like that. You know what I mean? So if you look at, so this is a great analogy. Deathwatch last year wasn't the right Marine faction to play. It had a stellar game into GSC. It had some good matchups anywhere else. But did you ever get to play against GSC? Probably not. If your opponent is smart, they just don't give you the matchup, right? So the analogy is very similar for Eldari actually at this tournament. A lot of people were playing 15 Scourges, etc., but if your opponents are good at pairings, they're simply going to go into that matchup knowingly, or they're going to never give you that matchup, right? Sure, if you played against double knights, then it's a little bit easier to try and use that as a second pin, right? But it's actually a trap more than otherwise to have an army that has a specific role against a specific army, unless in one scenario. If there's a scenario where you know an army is extremely popular, like say Guard for example, then you can have an army that might be a direct counter to that. But what you're actually doing is you're lining up so that another army will always play against Guard, because you're going to attack with your Guard counter and something else that's probably weak into the matrix, and that's going to play Guard, for example. So that's called a pin. And you can soft pin and hard pin. Hard pin when you have 2 direct counters. Soft pin is when you have 1 direct counter and a regular army going up against it that you want to probably remove from your matrix, for example. So in general, I think it's a bit of a trap. In 5-mans, it's a lot more important to have all-rounder armies or direct game plan armies. And direct game plan in terms of they play Warhammer rather than playing against a faction. In 8s, you've got a little bit of flex there, but you can't have an army that's too niche. Crusher Stampede with Eric Forsman, I think, is a good example of a good army, right? That's an army that can play lots of things, and he had like the Trigon, for example, for rapid ingress plays. to give his army a bit more flexibility, right? He had Swarmlord there as well, so he was ready to play a bunch of different matchups, and maybe his army was a bit better into some other matchups. So your matrix, instead of looking just flat across the board, it looks a little bit higher, flat, and then a little bit lower, for example. And you're going to be okay putting sometimes where it's a little bit higher, or you might use that as a pressure when you pair, and then you might just end up getting paired into mid and lower matchups. But you've used your pressure as against better matchups to cause more pressure throughout the matrix, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think when you're building those lists, which are more designed for 5-man teams, maybe the sword skews a little bit, but it's not to the extreme end as you do in 8-man teams. I wanted to talk a bit more about the sort of list comp for swords. Obviously, you took T-Suns and Imperial Guard most recently, which are generally, I would fair to say, more shooting-based. But when you're getting a sword list archetype, is there generally styles which fit better? So is it generally all gun lines? Like, obviously, typically Skark, from Poland, there's a very mathematical gun line army, go smash people. But there's also Anthony Vanilla, obviously, in Team USA, who is a very melee-oriented player, so who also does get swords. But so I guess the question is there generally an archetype which fits better, or any archetype can work?
It's really tough, actually. I think fundamentally, at a very high level of 40k, melee armies are at a slight disadvantage, right? For example, the very highest levels of 40k, every single person will... So for WTC, if you guys don't know as well, you're playing on 4-hour rounds here, right? So which does have quite a good impact. And like how the game plays, it is quite impactful. Because every single move you do, every turn, your opponent will pre-measure everything that your army can do at the highest levels. So there is, I think, an inherent disadvantage of playing a melee army into that role, because your opponent's ability to negate your army primarily comes through movement, and in longer round times, you're obviously having more ability to negate your opponent's army, right? An army like Thousand Suns was basically playing 51k, so, it's like, doesn't really play the game, right? It's kind of like, my Magnus can move 32 inches, my Sorcerers can shoot with indirect. That is the perfect type of army for a sword at WTC, right? Because, for example, apart from like a skew list like Olivier's 120 Black Templars, which is kind of not playing Warhammer as well to the same degree, right? But Thousand Suns is perfect because your opponent might not understand the army well, which is a good component. If you're a sword player, having a off-meta sort of list or an army that's quite hard to play against is very important. And then in addition, it has the flexibility that you can really use your 4-hour round timer. And it's not succumbing to, well, your army can move, advance and charge, you can move 10 and then charges, right? No, it's like, well, my army can move like 30 inches, I can do this, or I can do that, or I can do this, and then I can indirect you. So it really it puts the onus on you as the player in the driver's seat to play well and maximize your player skill by playing well. Whereas some armies like World Eaters, which I think actually World Eaters were very good at, WTC. We played World Eaters and Alex Taus, did very well for us. But an army like, say, for example, Blood Angels was definitely not the right choice, in my opinion. I think if you look at the top Seed 1 teams, almost every single team took Dark Angels with 15 Deathwing Knights, and only England took Blood Angels. Now, what the decision factor here really is that you can take an army that can maybe hit harder, and Manny's list was, of course, quite skewed in that sense that it was basically all gas, no brakes. I think he had 2 units with OC in his whole army or something. So, there's obviously whether that's the right build or whatever, like, let's just leave that aside. But England took that, and Manny is very clearly one of the best players, and particularly one of the best players in the world, one of the best players in their team, and that's historically been one of his playstyles. They've also got Vic on their team as well, which I think really fills that role. And then we've got all the other teams that have played Dark Angels, and we didn't play Dark. We took Blood Angels, which was a mistake again. But I think the decision factor comes around to this: would you rather have an army which is certainly more volatile in Blood Angels and definitely at the mercy of your opponent and has an absolutely shocking matchup into Thousand Suns? It's an 0-20 range. Or would you rather have Dark Angels, which is actually good against the best army in the meta, but isn't capable really of pushing larger wins, right? So would you rather have, and does your team composition need the ability to push larger wins, or does it have and need the ability to have a consistent win army? I mean, when you're talking about the differences between Blood Angels and Dark Angels in this sense, it's a bit of a no-brainer because Dark Angels was so strong. There was almost no downside to playing it. The downside of matchups that it couldn't push as hard were 1 to 2 to 3 diff points, maybe. But it was a consistent 12 army across the board. So this scenario is in that case where you know, it's kind of like, well, it doesn't really matter how much more you can push because this army is so good against everything else, for example. But yeah.
Yeah, a very elaborate answer again. It's great, and it's interesting to hear about. I guess putting, that many decision points in your opponent's mind makes things harder, as you said, with Thousand Suns. You endless possibilities and what you can do. And in regard to a little, maybe not to that extent, but does a little bit the same way, right? Obviously, you can go +3 move, or go +1 hit. I can do this, I can do that.
Yeah.
Aquilons,
yeah, of course. Guard's a very dynamic army, and it was actually a very dynamic army before Aquilons as well. Very move orientated, very board, very board orientated and stuff like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess I wanted to hear about that a bit more. So when you're developing a sword list, is that early on in the process? Do you try and identify that early on for your team comp, or is it better offsuited during the middle or towards the back end of the team composition?
Yeah. So it does depend on what kind of player you are. We're a little bit unique in New Zealand in the sense that I don't want to say I have like the rule of law, but for example, if there's a faction that is the best in the game and will be the big pusher, I will almost exclusively say like I'm going to be playing that. So a little bit lucky in that sense. Other teams have that as well, right? Like, so I think, you know, Manny's a good example as well. He will be like, I'm going to play this, for example. And he can swap onto a faction and because that faction is the best for the role. Yeah, it is. You do need to have a good understanding. Like, obviously, WTC is a little bit unique in that sense because, and Mperor Cup as well, because we had basically changes like a month beforehand, right? Which may sound like a long time, but for WTC, that's not much time at all. So yeah, you need to have it earlier on, and the earlier on you can identify that, the better it is, right? Because then you can start tailoring your list more and more and more. So yeah, it's a bit of a tough one. There's not a super great answer. You know, we had Jonty for our team, who was in a very, very similar situation. We were debating a long time to put him on Tau or Necrons, actually. Now, Jonty had been playing Necrons for a long time, and I would put him up there with probably, like, maybe the best Necron player in the world. He's extremely good. He's one of the strongest New Zealand players. And so, but he also played Tau. And actually, in my head, I thought, you know, Tau is one of those armies that definitely rewards an excellent pilot, and it's not going to be popular. So people might not have a ton of experience against it. So I did see a lot of value in Tal there. But at the end of the day, I thought if we can have Jonty on a curveball army that can also be a pusher, like that's a very deadly combination, right? A curveball army that is a pusher and gets big wins on big layups is almost the exact scenario that you want. And so, you know, Olivier Weiss, Black Templars was a lot like that. You know, Matt Bonet with the ACDC and Raiders was a lot like that as well. So that's really like the sweet spot to hit. So yeah, it depends on your players and it depends on your team, you know, your team players' personalities as a whole, like how comfortable are they with swapping. Obviously, like I'm very comfortable with swapping. I played T-Sons like back in 9th edition, but I played them twice before coming to WTC, and I played a total of 12 games before playing WTC, which is a lot lower than most people. Let's just say that at least. So I had a good chance to like pick them up and play them. Yeah.
Yeah, well, kudos to you for only having played 12 games and still be able to perform that level at WTC. It sounds like it's something that you are very good at, is playing a limited amount of games, but having that mental knowledge and understanding to still execute very well. Because I know other players wouldn't be able to perform to that extent and require those 20, 30, 40 plus games before they're, okay, I'm very comfortable. So yeah. I guess
although what I would say is that I had the Mutilith Beast build, which is a little bit more, you know, it's a bit more direct game plan as well, right? You know, hold and then defend, and then, you know, you had, as long as you knew how to use Magnus correctly, you know, and the play patterns are actually quite repetitive in Thousand Suns. Your deployment and play patterns are pretty repetitive. Your turn 1 is more or less the same. Your turn 2 is a rapid ingress plus an indirect, and that's kind of the same. So once you kind of understand that, like, okay, this is like everything you do every turn. I'm one of those players that whenever I play, I have extremely strict understandings of this is what I do turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4. Every single unit has a time and a place that rolls my army, and so I'm a bit weird like that as well.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, look, Brian and Jeremy Atkinson just had the magical Chaos Knights, and they must have had the smoothest of brains T-Sun's player time. So, but anyways, so you talked about there, I guess, ego or personality style for those sword players, and you definitely have to have some sort of personality to be a sword. What personalities or play styles would you generally recommend are best suited for the sword archetype?
Yeah, so I would say that and this is not to like self-inflate too much, but the sword role I think is the hardest role in teams. But that's not to say it's the most important. It's the most difficult to execute, but it's not the most important. So, for example, every diff point that I get is the same diff point that my defender gets when he's trying to play for a 7, for example, right? So, for example, we actually had Michael Taylor on our team playing Sisters, and we identified early in the Matrix that he was probably going to be playing against Thousand Suns a lot. Now, he actually had a build that was good against Thousand Suns as well, and because I'd never met I'd never met 4 of my teammates before going to to Belgium. But the day that I arrived, we had Michael and I had practice games. Then we played the day after we had practice games, and I coached him directly on how to just get better at playing against Thousand Suns. So as you can tell, like that's really important if he's attacking into Thousand Suns. It's just as important for my Thousand Suns attacker to be just as good as it is for me to be against someone else, because it's all the same diff points at the end of the day. So you can not only get mileage out of improving your other players against your faction, but you can do it against yourself as well. So back to like the player personality, I think defenders, it's really tough actually, because actually I think defenders get this wrong more in my experience. Though defenders get this wrong more often than not than sword players, for example. It's more common that I see people that are going into matchups playing Warhammer when they should be playing for a loss. And actually playing for a loss is a skill that I don't think gets recognized as much as it probably should. Because I see it going wrong so many times. Because I'm the pusher, obviously. So I see people that are going into matchups where I'm like, mate, you're playing for 5 points. And they're playing Warhammer. And then I 20 them because they should be playing for 5 points when they're trying to play for 8 or 9 points. And believe it may sound like a small thing, but it's a completely different game plan. When you go into a matchup, let's just say I played Pyrrha Cup, right? If every single opponent I played into was like, I'm just here for 5 points, then I would have lost another 15 diff points over my total score, right? I mean, that's a big difference, right? But instead, people are under the false impression that they're actually here to play an even game of Warhammer, which is just completely wrong, So being a defender, actually, it's really important to go into games and be like, okay, how does my opponent's army operate? How do I disable my opponent's army from activating, right? How do I take the gas out of my opponent's army, right? Well, if you're playing against maybe a Vic VJ style of Thousand Suns, that involves just staying behind walls. And if it means not leaving your deployment zone for a while, then you're not leaving your deployment zone for a while. Because if you let your opponent's army activate and table you faster, if you're playing a defender role, then you're losing the game faster. You need as much assets to survive. And at the previous WTC, I told our Custodes player, because this is when Wraith Knights were around, and he was playing against, he had played like 2 tournaments in his life, and he was playing against Wraith Knights and stuff like that. I said, look, Charles, I said, the plan is survive to 5. That's all you need to do. When he puts his Wraith Knight out, you pre-measure it. How far can your Wraith Knight go? +6 for Phantasm. Then you hide from it. You never let, if possible, you never let his Wraith Knight see your army and survive to 5. And because I said, Charles, you're not playing to even get 7 points in this matchup. You're playing to get 4 points. So you need to figure out how to make your differential less than 30 points in the game, right? That's your goal. And when you come back and you say 4, we're going to be super happy. When you come back and say 0, we're going to be like, man, could you not have gotten like a 2 or something, right? So in teams, obviously, there's a gradient of how successful you are in a match. And I think so for a defender role, and I guess it's kind of unique because being a pusher, I see that mistake happen so many times. So that's kind of where I see people go wrong playing against pushers, for example. So you need to have that willingness to lose mindset as a defender, for example. So go on.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's all good. That's great to hear from the defender perspective. And when Dave's talking about the defender role, he means the person on the receiving end. Is like the old magic term of who's the beatdown. You're the person who's getting beaten down, exactly. So that's sort of what he's alluding to. Not exactly. He's like, or attacker or defender in the pairings process, as you may be thinking. But so I guess I want to talk a bit more about that attacker mindset. So being the sword and stuff like that. What sort of mentalities do you think best suit the players that fulfill that role? Because obviously they have a niche build that's going to try and be the beatdown, very much so. Do you have to be someone who's willing to take a bit more risk and expose yourself? Or do you have to be a bit more cocky and confident? Or are you able to be a very stereotypical Nick Nanavati, I'm going to sit in my corner and score my points and still be a sword attacker?
Yeah. I would say one of the most important, obviously apart from being a good player, right? Like that's thing. And I think the sword role
might help a little bit being good at 40k.
The sword role really does require quite a high level of play. Like in terms of, I think it's a bit easier to play the defender role and sit in your deployment and play for a small amount of points, or play a take all comers, because then you're kind of playing 40k, right? But as a sword, you really need to be stepping on your opponent's throat as much as possible. So you need to be maximizing every single part of your army as much as possible. So to begin with, you need to be going into a matchup, understanding already what the matchup is at a very nuanced level. So you need to know going into the matchup if your opponent should be playing for a loss, or they should be playing for a very hard loss, or you need to evaluate very early on from their deployment, from your talk before the game, for example, how they think the matchup is going to go, right? Because all of that is absolutely critical. If you understand that your opponent thinks they're going to play Warhammer and you're a pusher, that's good, right? That means you're going to be able to play as much Warhammer as possible from early turns in the game, right? So for example, I played against Mperor Cup, a guy playing Imperial Agents who actually killed like 450 points of my army on turn 1. So, but the thing about it is that I knew from early on in the game that he was actually going to try and play Warhammer as much as possible. He thought he could get like an 8 or a 9, right? And I knew that based on his deployment and the way that he was judging the matchup and stuff like that. So already I'm like, okay, this is my mindset I need to be in, and this is how I need to deploy. I need to deploy a bit more carefully because he's actually going to play Warhammer. I disrespect him a little bit too much, but I mean, he had a massive go turn where he killed like 400 points, and then I just tabled his toughness 3 Battle Sisters army and Canis Rex afterwards. But basically, the deployment changes based on that, right? If you know and can evaluate the fact that your opponent thinks this matchup is X and they're going to play for a 5, then their deployment should mirror that to a certain degree, and your deployment needs to be as aggressive as possible, right? So if you're assuming that your opponent knows they're playing for a 5, you're putting the gas on the pedal straight from the get-go. If you're assuming and you think your opponent knows that they're playing for a medium game, they're playing for 8 or 9 points, then they will play Warhammer, right? And then you need to be slightly more cautious, but on the flip side, you're going to activate more. And when you can activate more, you can take advantage of every single thing that your opponent is giving you so much more, right? If your opponent feeds you 2 additional units on top of what you're then going to go and reach and kill in addition to that, you're going to be pushing much higher differentials because they're misevaluating how the game is supposed to go. So evaluating the game, understanding your opponents, there's a bit of psychology in that as well. Looking at how they deploy, looking at their army list, understanding the table and the matchup. Board pick is important there, of course, as well. Is really, really critical on pre-evaluating how the matchup should go. Here's a good example. Sorry, if your opponent takes fixed, for example, and you're a pusher, well, obviously they're just going to sit in their deployment zone, right? So what does your deployment look like after that? Well, you need to block their fixed as much as possible. I mean, it's not as popular these days, but happened to me at WTC. And then you need to figure out how you can push edges on top of that, right? They're obviously not going to be putting much pressure on you if they're unfixed, right?
Yeah, in theory, yeah, correct. And so I just wanted to ask a bit more deep dive in a bit. So you said that you do some psychology and some analysis. So what are some of the questions you ask your opponents to get a reading of like how you think they read the matchup? Obviously, deployment does make up a portion, but look, you've already gone through the attacker defender roll-off, selecting secondaries and put stuff in reserves or in transports already before deployments happen. So what are some questions you ask beforehand to decide, oh, okay, I think he's actually playing Warhammer or he's definitely playing for 4 or 5 differential?
Yeah. I'm not going to make it sound like I interrogate my opponent before like try and get like hard
bring him into the CIA room and it's like set him down. It's like, hey, what are you thinking? Come on, tell me.
but like let's go to WTC for example, right? Like there is so at WTC, right, you pair across the board, right? And you're obviously got like 16 people around you, and you kind of know like who's playing what army and stuff like that. And I personally believe that Warhammer is a social and psychological game to a certain degree. And there's definitely edges, and I'm sure we've all been in those situations, right? Where your opponent goes into the game, he's like got his face down, he's like, oh, I've already lost or something like that. Or actually people do so much psychology in Warhammer. You know, you've got the classic like, oh, you're smashing me, mate. You know, oh, it's a free win for you. And then they're playing as hard as they possibly can, right? Like, I personally hate that. I never ever do that. I'm usually just pretty honest about like, oh, yeah, this is kind of bad for me. And if I say that, I'll actually mean it. Like, I'm quite like straight up on the board. But yeah, if you pair into your opponent and then you see them across the pairing table and they're like, you know, you're kind of like, well, okay, you know, like we've got a good one here, right? Like, you know, or if they're like, you know, they're like slightly, you know, they're maybe they're not talking very much. They're, you know, they're very razor focused. They're executing in the very early game, like they're trying to maximize like things, or they might demonstrate, for example, like you playing as Thousand Suns, that we're like, okay, your Magnus can, if you select +2 to move. So for example, right, if your opponent goes, well, once you deploy your Magnus here, they go, okay, he can move 32 inches. If you move 16 and rotate your staff, can you see around here? And then if so, that won't cost you 5 points on Temporal Surge, so then you can still double Doombolt. If they say stuff like that, you're like, okay, like this guy kind of knows his stuff, right? You know, believe it or not,
Yes.
at that level, it's pretty hard, unless you've played Thousand Suns, which is why it's such an amazing army, right? But yeah, I mean, little stuff like that, you know, if your opponent's like playing, you know, if your opponent like move blocks your army so that he can get 1 point of getting a primary, then you're like, okay, like this guy, that's kind of how he's going to play. But you already know that if they're going for that move, for example, if my opponent went for that play and I knew that he had one move block unit to then try and secure primary for a turn, I already know that that's his whole game plan. So I know that that's going to be my objective for the rest of the game. So I need to push much harder on the other side and then squeeze them out so that they're never holding that ever again for the rest of the game. In addition, right? Or if they're going to try and hold that primary play there, I'm going to create a bit of board tension in the middle by sticking something on the middle objective, for example. So yeah, you need to react for the turn that they're playing for currently, for their deployment zone, and that should really impact how they're playing for like turn 3, 4, and 5 as well.
Oh, so great advice. Advice there in terms of how to get the deep dive on how much your opponent knows about the matchup and what goes where. I remember the very famous thing. I think Vic said it on one of your podcasts. And you think you played against one of the Woback brothers, not this past WTC, but the WTC before, where the Woback brother says, "Oh, it's this many cabal points for this, this, and this, and you can do that." And he's like, "Oh fuck, this guy knows his shit." So that's a very obvious example. Or when you, I remember, very similar. So I guess. So Stat Check obviously went to Champions Cup and Pumba was playing against their Black Templars player. And then after they do the pairings and stuff like that, he realizes he has Cypher. And he's like, oh, what does Cypher do? It's like a Vector. And the guy goes, fuck. Like, just didn't read the list and didn't prepare. And like, well, shows sort of how much they know about the matchup, right? So some nice little tips and tricks there to know. So you talked a bit earlier on about that, practicing those matchups and making sure your greens are greens, essentially, all those 4s and 5s. So when you're preparing to be a sword player in a team's event, are you specifically just practicing those big green matchups and trying to refine them more? Or are you practicing some of your yellows to see if they can potentially move to a green? Or if they're, oh shit, I think they're neutral, but they're actually bad? What's part of the process for you?
So let's just assume that we don't have infinite time, because some WTC teams, these days have actually infinite time, or they have more players even playing the games behind them and stuff like that. So let's just assume you're like me. You only get to play, 10 to 15 games before WTC, which I think is actually on the very much lower side of things. What I would do is I would try and play as many games as possible to find the good list. Well, typically that would come after like 6 or 7 games. I would already know, and one of my goals this year going to WTC was, I said, David, I want to have the best list in the room. Because something I didn't have last year, so I thought that was the thing I wanted to improve on the most. Actually, I actually had a paper note that said on my computer screen, "Have the best list at WTC." So I really wanted to push the boundaries on that. So nailing down the list is, once you got that down, obviously that's great. So typically you do that in the pre-list submission phase, so that's great. Then what you want to do as a pusher is actually not focus on those matchups you already think are bad. What you want to do is instead, because you're not actually going to play those realistically, right? For example, I never played the Mirror in my testing because I was never going to play that at WTC. No, why?
No,
why would I give someone
it's waste of practice? Yeah.
Why would I give someone the chance of going second against me when I'm playing the Mirror and then secret mission me and beat me 12-8? No. Why would it? That's ridiculous, right? That's not what I'm here to do. And that may sound weird to people, right? But it's the same as Deathwatch versus GSC, right? You're probably never going to play that matchup. So what's the point in even building a list for it and even practicing it, right? So yeah, I was playing against things like like luckily I played a lot of Hypercrypt like personally, so that was a matchup I was already super comfortable with, and it was a good list at the tournament. I played Tyranids as well, so I kind of had those two bases covered. So for me, it was playing into stuff like Death Guard, Blood Angels, World Eaters, stuff like that that I needed to know. Okay, this is definitely 20 range, and then just getting all around like game plan, playing against like variety of armies. Because once again, like I had the beast build, which was pushing differentials by holding and denying primary very quickly, and then had a lot of table pressure on top of that as well. So yeah, that's kind of the way that I focus on things. It's much about learning the army, and so actually when I played against Canada in the final round, I'd never played against Custodies before. So actually, funny story, when we're doing the pairings, I was playing against Canada's captain, really lovely guy.
Chris Haynes, yeah.
Chris Haynes, yeah, sorry. Forgot his name there. And he had the Warden Brick, right? And so, during the pairings, we've got our coaching staff behind us as well. I had Custodies as a 3, which was wrong, right? But during the pairings, when I'm going down as third defender, we have him and another player down. Another matchup, which I believe is an actual draw, and Chris on Custodies. So we stop the pairings. I get a judge. I tell my coaches to get a judge. And I said, "Can you get a confirmed ruling on how the Warden declaration of a 4-up Feel No Pain interacts with the Temporal with the Cabal Ritual?" Basically, short story. You have to declare whether you're going to do the 4-up Feel No Pain before I even have to say if I'm doing Temporal Surge or not, which is really, really big, because basically you can ask them, well, are you going to 4-up Feel No Pain? If they say no, then you Temporal Surge your Sorcerer, then indirect them, and then you basically kill them, right? It's the same with you could then Temporal Surge and then Doombolt, for example. So stuff like that, you kind of obviously you're not going to maybe play against everything, but you need to be able to be work on the fly with stuff like that, and that just comes from like a huge experience of playing Warhammer. I kind of know Custodies are, they want in my head of categorizations, they're the big slow army that, does a ton of damage immediately, but they're a big slow army. So like by definition, if you move and play well, and of course if you have 3 disc sorcerers, that usually helps as well. You can just outplay them by moving around the board usually. So yeah, big slow army. Put lots of damage into one unit at a time. It'll evaporate.
Yeah, I think it fits the ideology of slow army, melee focused, a bit tougher and stuff like that. You're not going to see a Death Guard army zooming around the battlefield anytime soon, right? That you sort of have that ideology and that, I guess, play game design philosophy built in. So we've talked a lot about the pairings process, and I know you talked about being first defender for Pyro Cup with Guard, obviously getting table pick, and then obviously being third defender most recently at WTC. And obviously you have a big role in the pairings process, but that's not true for all sword players. I know obviously here in Australia, Liam Hackett, very famous. He's a very typical sword player, but he'll stay generally typically quite far away from the pairings process. And so what advice would you give for players who don't want to do anything with an Excel spreadsheet, which I don't understand why, but because I personally love them. But what advice would you give to sword players who don't have a hand in the pairings process?
Yeah. If you don't want anything to do with an Excel spreadsheet, first up, you should not be playing teams, because there's nothing more that I hate than people that don't get their fucking matrix done.
Oh,
it's my one swing.
Buddy.
Yeah, I hate that. So what's really important though is that as an all-round, as a sword player, as a pusher, your matrix should be rather binary, right? It should be big win, or as Liam VSL famously has it, 5 and 0. So, like, I think WTC last year, I think his matrix is like, and for the last couple of teams, his matrix is literally 5s and 0s. So basically, you're playing as a player at that point, right? It's like you're playing as the Liam VSL, or you're playing as the Innes Wilson on the team, right? So you're either here to get 5s or you're not here at all, right? So it's really important if, like, maybe you're in, a Seed 3 team, or you're in a Seed 4 team, and you're a player that's probably a little bit better than the seed bracket you should be playing in, and that happens at WTC. Your matrix should look like 5s and 0s, or to that extent, right? It should look like 4s and 2.5s, or 4s and 3s, right? So what you really need to do then is make sure that your 3s are 3s, and that, actually, that's just the most important part. You need to make sure that anything you think could be a bad matchup is actually detailed down. And your team needs to have the instruction, okay, if you put me into a 3, it's going to be it's going to be in that 12 range. Maybe I could skill it out, get 11, 12. But if you put me into a 4, the upper range is 20. So that's what I would say if you don't want to be involved in the pairings. That, obviously have, table choice. if your army requires table choice, or if your army can be usually hugely benefited by table choice, that's obviously important to have in your notes section there as well. But yeah, your team, if pairings is pairings, the teams that are better at pairings have more people involved, I think, through a layer kind of bureaucracy, right? Like layer. We have in New Zealand, we have 3 people, and then we have like coaches behind us that do help with table picks and stuff like that as well. So yeah, I would say that the most important thing is to make sure that your bad matchups are your bad matchups, because your good matchups should be very obvious anyway.
Yeah, that makes complete sense, and it's good to hear. So there's some advice to people who just want to stay away from the pairings process, but still want to get those big dick 20-0 wins. So there you go. I guess when you're obviously at the table and you're communicating, obviously during WTC you have obviously 4-hour rounds, you have coaches to support you and stuff like that. Are you typically communicating, I guess, back to your support staff more frequently or less frequently than others typically do?
Yeah, it's a little bit different or unique for me as well, because as being a part of New Zealand, I'm the most experienced player on the team, so a lot of the info flows through me in terms of like where we are in the round and stuff like that. And then in addition like that, so actually at WTC, we had Ben Jones as one of our coach who played Thousand Suns. So actually at the start of every single round, I told Ben, can you get my army, bring it to my opponent, explain my opponent everything in my army, all my enhancements, whilst I ran around all of our player tables before every round and talked with each player about the matchup during the round, right? And the reason why it's that, because I want to coach all of our players before the round, of course. Even if it might not be telling them how to play, right? It might just be, hey, what's your estimates for the round? How are you feeling? How are you thinking about playing the round? What's your game plan, stuff like that, right? And after the pairings, we would also go around in a circle and say, hey, this is I'm playing for a 4, I'm playing for a 3, I'm playing for a 2, so that just to really solidify what we're here to try to achieve in our round, for example, right? So a lot of the time Ben would be running my opponent through the army, and I would obviously tell my opponent, hey, by the way, I just need to go around and talk with my players beforehand. Ben's going to run you through stuff, of course, and then I'd be at the table. But actually during the table, weirdly enough, my coach, so the information does flow through me to a large degree, and Finn, our captain, as well. And the whole thing around like when you tell people to push and everything like that is a whole nother like subject, and is very hard to get right as well. But I actually at the table, I'm like reasonably quiet, and at the same time I'm often away from the table a bunch actually. So my coaches actually usually stay by my table because I'll just wander off when my opponent's turn is happening. Like there's so
just
many
off of the fairies. You're thinking about other things.
No, because there's so many. The thing about WTC is that there's so many good games happening that every single game I probably walk off 3 times to go and like see. Oh, this is like Vic versus someone else, or this is like Anthony versus whatever, right? And so I'm literally just like, yeah, I'm just gonna go like. I tell my opponent, like, you can think as long as you want, man. Like, it's 4 hours, right? Everyone's, like, really nice anyway. I'm like, dude, you can do whatever you want, man. My coach is going to be here. If you need to roll something, my coach is, like, fine with it or whatever like that. And I'll just be over there. I'm just going to look at some games really quick. Because at the same time, like, I would rather see my opponent play as best as possible as well. And I don't want to be them, like, sitting over the table looking at everything they do, right? Like, I never want to play. Like, who... I didn't come to Belgium to play like that anyway, Despite it's the highest level of competition, like, I never want to play like that. And actually, when you come back to the board, it can kind of refresh you a little bit as well, right? You can kind of be like, okay, this is what my opponent's done, and then you can reevaluate the board and stuff like that as well. So, it's, in 4-hour rounds, it's a lot different from playing, like, 3-hour rounds in that sense, yeah.
Yeah, but that time away, as you said, may help you, though. Just get that bit of break, like turn off your brain a bit, because obviously Downside's not the easiest army in the world to pilot, obviously, despite you saying the play patterns. Look, I know many people say T-Suns is not the most easy army to play, but refresh your memory, then come back and do your job the best way. So, but what's happened sometimes in the game of Warhammer is sometimes shit hits the fan, right? Sometimes you got a bad data input, you think it's a light green, it goes more to yellow or orange, or the game's just skewed, right? Like when you're pushing for those big differentials, sometimes shit hits the fan. The dice don't go your way, or you made a misplay. So what advice would you give to those sword players who have made that push and are trying to correct the shit exactly?
Yeah. So if you're playing in a scenario like that, then you need to contact your coaches like as soon as possible, right? You need to let them know, hey, or if you have coaches, or if you have a round estimate, you need to look at the round estimate and just stop what you're doing, get the current round estimate where you're at, and then make a decision on where you need to play after that. for example, if this is going to turn, like, say your swing down will turn the game into a draw, then I would say personally try and hold there. Because if that means that you could push more and go into a loss, I wouldn't be comfortable with that at WTC, for example. If this means that you're already in the draw territory 100%, then I would say the risk is like, it's a bit risky to go for the play. Maybe you need a spike in Overwatch, something like that. Then you could push you into a win. Then I would say try and go for the win. So it's really important to get the round estimates at the time there when it comes in. I mean, stuff happens during a game of Warhammer. That's, absolutely true. I played against a Tyranid player who scored 37 secondaries in 4 turns against me, and then was my worst loss at WTC. Like, there's just nothing you can do about that, right? Like, okay, he had 2 units left and he drew behind him in lines established locust, and one was a fucking Biovore, right? Like, great, man.
Average, mate, average.
Yeah, he's like, oh, cool, I have literally 2 models, 7 points. I'm like, awesome. Like, so, stuff like that can happen. It's, you need to try and identify that as early on as possible. Like, if your opponent... So I played against Nathan Roberts. So we play like a bunch of team tournaments here in the UK as well. We've got one coming up in mid-November. So I played against Nathan Roberts from StatCheck, and I was playing the Guard 30 Kaskin list, and he had Plague Burst Crawlers. He straight up one-taps a unit of 10 Kaskin with 3 Plague Burst Crawlers, which is like incredibly unlikely. I mean, he can Battle Shock them, and that's fine, but he just straight up killed 10 on turn 1, and they were Battle Shocked, and I was like, well, that's like, cool. It was something like 1.8% chance to happen. And because I'm saving on 4s, I was like, well, that's kind of crap. So yeah, you kind of know, like, in your head, okay, just knock it down a point, right? Like, just knock it down a point. And so, during any serious team tournament, you should have like a scorecard. We've got one of these, which is like 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, all the way up to 20. And you basically hand that around and you just point to whatever number you think your current matchup is. And then you keep a tally going like that. And, you just ask for the paper, hey, put that in something. I mean, everyone has like dice. Believe it or not, I'm as lucky or as unlucky as every single other player in the world. But sometimes people do things to mitigate their luck a little bit more than others. Yeah.
That's great advice there. And so I guess in playing the round, do you try and play your matchups more quickly and fast to guarantee, we've got the 20 secure in the bag, or we've got a very favorable win, like a 16-4, obviously Liam VSL, very stereotypically, or Nassim, for example, they play the games very quick, they get it done in 30 minutes, easy 20. Done and dusted, off they go to the races. So do you think that's the advantage and something you should be doing as a sword player, or it doesn't really matter as long as you guarantee the result? That's all that matters at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I
it's
think
hard,
whatever
right?
Suits your, whatever suits your playstyle is the most important thing to begin with. If there is zero logical sense to think that you have to get your game done quick to put pressure on all the other teams, because realistically, they will have a matrix, their own internal matrix, and they'll already know what the game state is, for example, right? Like, if I'm crushing this guy, right, then he's going to be putting in, like, 1 or 2 points anyway, right? And that's already going to circulate with the team. So you don't need to finish your game quickly to do stuff like that. I mean, I think most of my games are over in, like, an hour and 10 for WTC or something ridiculous like that anyway. So that was, like, pretty quick, but... Yeah, it's going to percolate through the team regardless. If you're absolutely stomping someone, they will have like a coach there will already let the team know that their player is getting absolutely stomped, for example. So, you could even say like, hey, by the way, this is a huge upswing in my army. Expect them to like be able to push, wanting to push on the other tables, and that's where you become a really next level player. Was when you're like, I've had a huge upswing. Expect them to start pushing on other tables, so that the other players might anticipate, okay, these guys are going to need to like push because they're behind on other tables, for example. That level of communication is actually really hard to achieve, and I think a lot of teams, even at the very highest level, kind of struggle with that to a certain degree as well.
Well, for now, anyways, we'll see. The game of Warhammer keeps evolving and evolving. The processes and understanding keeps getting better and better. So, look, ask again 1 year from now, Dave, and who knows, maybe this is a common practice for all the Tier 1 teams like yourself and Team New Zealand now. So, we'll see what happens. So, maybe staying on topic. So, also without deep diving too much, when those people are sort of those neutral matchups, like sometimes someone's going down, it's like, hey, I need you to push. I need you to push that differential and try and get a bigger win. What are some of the common things that you will maybe circulate or you try and do in your own games to push those differentials? Obviously, assuming maybe in the process, like you don't care if, say, you're on track to get a 12 differential, like a higher side of a draw, but you need to be pushing to those 15s or 16s, and you have the time to obviously do that. And you maybe it doesn't even that if you go downswing to a 7. So what are some of the things that you would try and do or advise people to do?
Yeah. Obviously, every matchup is a bit different, but at a very high level, you need to make a calculated risk of what is the risk versus reward in the situation, right? Let's say, for example, I've got a Tyrannofix, right? And I'm like, dude, if I just park this guy here, and then his Vindicator comes, or his Predator comes around, and I just spike a 6 on the Overwatch, like, okay, that's a huge swing, right? So, for example, right? Or, here's a classic one. Like, back then at WTC, should I Temporal Surge my Disc Sorcerer to try and one-shot their Disc Sorcerer with a Doom Bolt, right? Like, that'd be a great swing, for example, right? Or, which, by the way, I never did. Even in my practice, I was like, no, I'm not that kind of crazy. But a lot of people were like, yeah, fuck it, I'll try it. Some swings like that, I think are, it's really difficult, though, because this actually comes down to more like team composition, actually. And this is why I think World Eaters is quite a good army, and I said this in our WTC recap, is that having some armies in your team composition that can turn the switch on at a moment's notice is actually quite a powerful tool that not a lot of armies have access to, right? Let's say you're playing like Crusher Stampede or Tyranids, right? Well, you're kind of locked into your game plan right from your deployment, right? You can't all of a sudden be like, yeah, man, I'll just advance my units and, not shoot them and then can't charge. It's like, it doesn't really happen like that, right? Or if you're playing Blood Angels, like, yeah, you can have that to a certain degree, right? Like, you can start being like, okay, I'm going to try go for some longer charges, for example, right? But World Eaters is actually a really good tool in that if your World Eaters player is playing in against a matchup, and Alex Taus had this against the Austrian player Kev on Ironstorm, he was like, well, we need to push now. So actually my army's got the reach and capability of going for a push from a position where it was previously playing defensive. So I would say it's more about like making, if you are a player that wants to capitalize on people's mistakes, then you need to try and have an army that's going to try and do that. But some armies aren't like that, right? Like Death Guard, you can't be like, yeah, man, I'm just gonna really squeeze this guy out of the board all of a sudden. It's like, no, like if all your stuff's down that side of the board, it ain't getting to this side of the board, man. It's kind of like a 10-10, right? So playing armies with higher volatility would be a kind of way to put the screws on in a proverbial sense there.
Yeah, as much as that Blight Lord Terminator may want to try, it's not going to make beyond a 16-inch charge, right? Like it can only move 4 and then charge 12, or it can only do so much. So no, I think that's some great advice there. And I think it's
more like you need to just try and like puzzle solve and analyze where certain, like, if you could make this happen, that would be big, right? Like it might be a chance where you can make a 10-inch charge with your Rhino or something like that, and that would like tie the unit up, and then you would have stage your whole army behind that or something. Maybe plays like that, for example.
Yeah, great advice there. So obviously you're part of Team Ignite, and you have a couple of the world's best players on there, and very famously, obviously, Liam VSL and Brian Cyber, people who I view as generally go-getters. They get those big wins. And I know Brian can play; they can play different roles, obviously themselves, but very stereotypically they play that role. Is there any like tips or tricks you've picked up from those players or other players who serve that role in that attacking format that you think the audience may appreciate or like to know?
Yeah, I mean, so Brian's historically known as a very combat oriented player, right? He's really fantastic at playing melee armies, right? And so whenever I'm looking at builds, I'm kind of thinking, looking at armies, I'm thinking like, well, what would if I'm playing against like a melee army, or if I'm playing melee components, I'm like, well, what would Brian do to try and fuck me here, right? He'd be like, well, I'm gonna like do this weird like base thing and then like fight through my unit, so even if you have fight first, and do something like that. So like learning kind of combat tricks from Brian has obviously been a big part. And then Liam is someone who will he's got a very good sense of when to play aggressive and when not. So Liam is historically a very aggressive player, obviously, but the only chance you're going to have to beat him is if you actually play defensively and try and be able to put the onus on him to play to play aggressive, right? So that just goes to show at what a technical level of a technically aggressive player he is, right? Like he's got a list where typically he'll have a very good list, but WTC his list wasn't very good. Eldari just wasn't really the choice there, right? But typically he'll have a great list. It'll be able to play a range of matchups, and it'll have options that, if you want to stage well, it'll be able to stage really well. Turn 2, he'll be able to go, all in. So I think that's definitely something I could get better at, is actually just all-inning people a lot more. Liam is someone that will know well, if I just put like Liam and I played a game last night, and he was like, yeah, I'm just gonna put the map was fucking terrible for me. He was like, yeah, I'm just gonna disembark my Fabius Bowl unit, put the 10 guys right in the middle of the 2 super elves on Crucible, and it's like. He's like, and I had 2 Exocrines and a Neuro Tyrant to Overwatch with +1 AP and Strength, and I was like, okay, this seems good. But Liam already knew, like, he was like, well, I've got a blank AOC plus cover, so I'm taking 4 ups, and I was like, yeah, and I was like, so that game didn't go well, and so like understanding like where you can play aggressive is probably the biggest thing that I still learned from Liam in particular as well. But those 2 guys are good at armies that like Brian's really good at armies that I'm not good at as well. So, or armies that I don't play. So that's a big piece there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the art of the Roosh, as I like to understand it, is the art of the Roosh. So I'm sure we'll get to hear more about that eventually. So I also understand recent times, Miss Dave, that you've launched your own, like the other upper tiers of content creation, a coaching service yourself. So I'll give yourself a chance to have a plug about what your coaching service is all about. And is it only Imperial Guard or is it everything in between?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I started coaching recently. Thanks to the shout out, of course. I actually do a bunch of different packages. So I do individual 1-hour sessions, and I do like game sessions and everything like that. Primarily Tyranids, Necrons, Guard, and Plus. But I can obviously coach if you're not at the Warhammer World Champs level, if you're not at the WTC higher level, I can obviously coach for basically any faction there as well, because it's more about understanding the game. And then I do team consultation as well. So if you've got a team tournament coming up, I do a 2-hour session where I work through your matrix predictions, your strategies, your team composition, your list adjustment for what you're expecting to hit. So, a lot of stuff what we talked about here, basically. So if you've got stuff like that coming up, yeah, feel free to get in touch. I've actually had to turn away a couple of clients because I'm super busy at the moment. But everyone, I mean, I've had a fantastic response so far, and I've really enjoyed it. I've got some of my students or clients, I'm not sure what to call them, but students going to WCW, LVO. I've got a couple of WTC players looking to get better at exactly like what we've talked about in this. And I go over like how I see the game, my philosophy of how to be pushing, or if they want to be pushers, and obviously the state of guard and stuff like that as well is really big. Yeah.
I'm sure you can. So you go ahead.
I was going to say you can get in touch at like 40kfireside@gmail.com. It'll maybe Sam will put it in the description or something like that. Yeah,
I've got it in the description. I'll have it in the description down below. So for links for such. Look, I'm sure you could create like colloquial term for what your clientele people are. Some young Padawans or Jedi, aspiring sorcerers. There we go. Aspiring sorcerers.
That's a good one. Yeah.
There you go. That's a good one. Yeah, you should pay me a commission for that one. No, I'm kidding. So all good. But as we wrap things up, is there any final plugs or shout outs you'd like to make, Dave, before we wrap things up?
Oh yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm a part of the 40k Fireside podcast with Vic VJ as well, and with Team Ignite. We're really a faction that likes to play the game like how we believe the game should be played, and it's been a wonderful journey getting this far. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, and I think we're also doing a membership zone for 40k Fireside sometime soon. So we're expecting to have like coaching level workshops and everything like that come out and everything like that. So. But Vic and I haven't even announced it yet, but Vic and I are going to be bringing that out sometime soon, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Heads up, Vic, by the way. This is what we're doing. I've decided now. But no, fantastic. Taking that next step forward. And I've been a fan of your podcast for a long time. So, and I appreciate having this chat. And look forward to hearing many more tales and stories of various events and your own ideas of the meta. So, fantastic. Thanks, and really appreciate it. So just before we wrap things up, just have our own little self-promotional thing. So obviously part of the Down Under 40k network in the superior oceanic country of Australia rather than New Zealand.
Hell yeah.
I love my Kiwis. They're a great bunch. But in the Australia and New South Wales region, if you want early access to some New South Wales events, sign up for the Patreon, get early access to tickets and pre-sale tokens, etc. We also, the league sponsor is Tip Top Terrain. They create WTC and GW layouts. So the league terrain sponsor. They're fantastic. Obviously, us Australians unfortunately don't have easy access to Wayland Yutani terrain or other big major terrain factors, but Tip Top Terrain and Daniel does a great job. And then last but not least, we got Etsy. So D6 Designs AU, great dice, and we've got a bunch of down to 40k dice already set up. So use the code DU40KL for 10% off. And that's all. So thank you very much, Dave, for this great chat. It's been very informative. I'm now re-energized and ready for my next team's event, which is just over a week away. And
nice.
I'm sure people... I'm playing Sisters, so Hallowed Martyrs
awesome.
Sisters. So
how many Exorcists do you have?
Oh, only minimum 3. It's only
Okay,
minimum
good.
3. Okay.
Good.
Yeah. So yeah,
Awesome, bro.
no triumph though. Go
Okay,
ahead.
that's fair. Yeah, I was gonna say, is it a 5-man or 8-mans or 6 or something? Or
8 man. So 8 man. So it's a
awesome,
big. So it's a 12 team, 8-person team. So it's great.
awesome.
Making the trip
That's
down.
wicked,
So
bro. I
yeah.
think
So very
sisters are in a great position at the moment. They're
Yeah.
definitely they're a great example of an army that has some upper wins and some lower wins and some mid range as well, right? So you've got the ability with 3x's to just invalidate some armies right from the get go. So really powerful to use in that pin position for there as well. And triumph or no triumph, playing Hallowed Martyrs, yeah, that's an interesting one. I know Vic was playing Hallowed Martyrs at Coventry 2-day recently as well. So yeah, I found that. If you are playing against like Guard or something like that, you do need to have a huge amount of 5+ rolls in the Miracle Dice Bank because a lot of their breakpoints are going to be at toughness 11. So maybe just don't play that matchup anyway. But Hallowed Martyrs is super flexible, so it's interesting to see the Martyrs versus the Bring of Flame kind of archetypes play out in teams, for example, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you're spoiled by gameplay. How about I just don't play a guard and I don't have to worry about the 5-ups, right? So,
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
There you go. Like, you need to have a game plan against guards, so we'll see how it goes, right?
For singles events, absolutely. And then for teams, look, we have our matrix predictions and maybe some sneaky tech in there, or I'm just praying it doesn't happen. So we'll see what happens. So.
Send me a link to it, man. I want to see these super secret
absolutely.
tech.
Absolute super secret tag of I've played it at least a couple of times and know roughly what to do and see what happens. So no, fantastic.
Awesome.
Appreciate the chat and thanks for everyone for listening. Have a great night and take care. Bye bye.